Vegeta had been alone for 6 hours when the sky tore open. He'd wanted it that way. Capsule Corp's gravity chamber was calibrated to 450 times Earth's pull, and even that felt like standing in a puddle lately. So he'd left the compound before dawn, flown out past the mountain range Bulma insisted he stop cratering, and found a stretch of dead volcanic rock where nobody would interrupt him and nothing would break that mattered. He needed silence. He needed to hit something that could hit back, and there was nothing left on Earth that qualified, and the thought of that, of having run out of things worth fighting, sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't spit out. So he trained the only way that still meant anything, alone, at the ragged edge of what his body could survive, pushing past the point where lesser men would have stopped breathing. He'd cycled through Super Saiyan an hour in, burned past it into the second form 20 minutes after that, and he was holding there, gold hair standing in a corona of raw light, the air around him warping with heat, his aura screaming against the wind, when he decided he wasn't done, wasn't close to done. He gathered ki into both palms, packed it dense as a collapsing star, and threw everything he had into a single point in the dirt. The explosion should have carved a crater and nothing more. That was the plan. That was every time before. This time the light didn't stop at the ground. It kept going, down, and somehow also sideways, folding in a direction that didn't belong to any of the three he understood. And the last thing Vegeta registered on Earth was the horizon buckling like paper held too close to a flame. Then there was no ground at all, just falling, and a wrongness in his stomach that had nothing to do with altitude, and a smell, sulfur, old blood, something scorched that had once been alive, filling his lungs before his eyes had even adjusted to the dark. He hit rock hard enough to crack it. For a moment he simply lay there, which was not something Vegeta did. His body was telling him it had been minutes since he'd last drawn breath in a place that made sense, and every instinct he had screamed that the rules had changed. The sky above him was wrong, a bruised orange-violet, two moons hanging low and too close, one of them scarred like something had taken a bite out of it. The air tasted of ash. Somewhere distant, something screamed, and it was not a human sound. Vegeta sat up, cursed, rolled his shoulder where the impact had jarred it, and felt the armor there, dented, not broken, and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Fine," he said to no one. "Fine. Wherever this is, he'd been dropped into worse. Frieza's ships. The husk of Namek burning behind him. A cell on a planet whose name he'd stopped bothering to remember decades ago. Strange skies didn't frighten him. What frightened him, what had, if he was honest with the ugly little coward thought he crushed the instant it surfaced, was the sensation, faint but unmistakable, that whatever had torn open behind him back on Earth had closed. There was no rift left, no seam in the air to climb back through. He was here until he found another way, or made one. Vegeta stood, rolled the tension out of his neck, and did the only thing that had ever made sense to him in an unfamiliar place. He reached out with his senses and searched for power. What answered nearly staggered him. Not one signature, dozens, scattered across a landscape he still couldn't see the edges of, pulsing at wildly different magnitudes. Some small and vicious, like snapping animals. Some vast and slow and ancient, humming at a frequency that made his back teeth ache. And beneath all of it, distant but unmistakable, one signature so large it felt less like a person and more like a mountain range that happened to be aware of itself. It sat somewhere to the east, past a black horizon jagged with spires, radiating something that wasn't quite ki as he understood it. Heavier, older, soaked in centuries of conquest, the way a blade gets soaked in rust. Something in Vegeta's chest, the same something that had never once in his life let an insult to his pride go unanswered, sat up and took interest. That, he thought, that is what I came here to find. He didn't know where here was. He didn't care yet. There was a mountain-sized power on this planet, and until he'd measured himself against it, nothing else mattered. Not the strange sky, not the smell of old blood in the wind, not the sound, now closer, of something with too many footsteps moving fast across broken ground toward him. He turned unhurried toward the noise. They came out of the rock formations in a loose pack, 6 of them, humanoid but wrong in the way animals bred for one purpose are wrong, blades fused into their forearms in place of hands, mouths split too wide over rows of jagged teeth. Tarkatan raiders, though Vegeta had no name for what he was looking at and felt no particular need to learn one. They moved like predators who'd never once lost a fight, fanning out to surround him with the casual confidence of things that had done this 100 times. One of them, the largest, scarred across one blade arm, snarled something in a language Vegeta didn't recognize but understood perfectly well anyway. It wasn't a greeting. "You want to test me," Vegeta said, mostly to himself, arms folding across his chest, "before I've even had breakfast." The lead raider lunged. It was fast, genuinely fast, faster than most things Vegeta had cut through on lesser worlds, blade arm carving a horizontal line meant to open him from hip to throat. Vegeta didn't dodge so much as simply decline to be where the blow landed, a half-step shift that put him inside the creature's reach instead of away from it, and drove one gloved fist into its sternum with enough force that the sound wasn't an impact so much as a detonation. The raider left the ground, folded around Vegeta's fist, and came apart against a rock spire 30 feet back in a way that ended the conversation permanently. The other 5 didn't hesitate, which Vegeta respected in the narrow way he respected anything that didn't waste his time with begging first. He didn't bother powering up. Didn't bother with Super Saiyan, didn't even raise his ki past a idle simmer. He simply moved, a backhand that shattered a jaw and sent its owner cartwheeling into 2 more, a knee that folded a raider's ribs inward, a final open palm strike, almost lazy, that put the last one through a slab of standing rock hard enough to crack the whole formation into gravel. Silence settled back over the wasteland. 6 bodies, 1 heartbeat elevated, and it wasn't his. Vegeta exhaled through his nose, unimpressed, already turning his attention back east toward the mountain-sized signature that had actually earned his interest. "Pathetic," he said to the wind. "If that's the best this world sends first, I've wasted a trip." He didn't know yet that 6 dead Tarkatan raiders 3 days' march from Shao Kahn's outer garrisons was not a small thing. He didn't know that Outworld's extermination packs answered to a chain of command that reported directly to a throne room built from the bones of 100 conquered kingdoms, and that a squad going silent triggered a response as automatic as a nerve reflex. He didn't know any of that, and it wouldn't have changed anything if he had. What he did know, what he could feel, growing sharper the longer he walked east across cracked black stone, past skeletal trees and the ruins of something that might once have been a temple, was that the world he'd fallen into was dense with strength. Not evenly, not gently, in violent, concentrated pockets, like the whole place had been built by something that valued power above every other consideration and had shaped a civilization around proving it. For the first time since Majin Buu had been sealed away and the universe had gone quiet and unbearably safe, something in Vegeta's chest loosened. Good, he thought. Good. Something here might actually be worth the effort. He walked for the better part of a day, didn't fly, not yet, some old instinct telling him to read the terrain before he announced himself to the sky, and the land told its own story as he went. Battlefields, layered on battlefields, Old bones ground into the dirt so thoroughly they'd become part of the rock. Rusted standards bearing a skull and dragon sigil, planted at intervals like this territory had changed hands and been reconquered so many times the act of claiming it had become ritual. Twice he passed makeshift arenas, circles of raised stone, blood dried black into the grain, chains bolted into support pillars at heights meant for things considerably larger than a man. He was still turning that over. A world that built dedicated architecture for organized violence, that treated combat as infrastructure rather than accident, when the second patrol found him. This one was smarter, 8 fighters instead of 6, and at their center, not a raider but something else entirely, a Shao Kahn warrior, easily 9 feet at the shoulder, 4 arms folded, with the coiled patience of something that had never once needed to rush into a fight it was going to win. Its escort fanned out around it, weapons drawn, and the Shao Kahn itself simply watched Vegeta approach with an expression that read less like hostility and more like assessment. "You killed a border pack," it said, in a low rumble that carried across the broken ground. Common tongue, accented strangely but understandable, alone, with your bare hands, that interests my prince. Your prince, Vegeta repeated flatly, not the one radiating off that skyline like a dying star. Something that might have been amusement flickered across the Shao Kahn's tusked face. No, that one does not send scouts. That one does not need to. It rolled one set of shoulders, settling into a low stance that 4 arms made genuinely unsettling to watch. I am here to learn what you are before you're brought before anyone who matters. Consider it a courtesy. Consider it wasted time, Vegeta said, and let just a thread of his ki bleed into the air around him. Not a full release, nothing close to what he actually had, just enough that the ground began to hairline crack under his boots, and the escort took an involuntary step back. But if a warm-up is what it takes to get an audience with something worth my time, I'll indulge you, once. The Shao Kahn's 4 fists closed. Careful what you wish for, Outworlder. I am not, Vegeta said, gold light already kindling at the edges of his hair. From Outworld, whatever that means. And I am considerably less careful than you'd like. He didn't wait for it to close the distance. He went Super Saiyan in a single violent pulse. Light tearing outward, rock splitting in a ring around him, the escort scattering back with weapons raised and useless, and crossed the space between himself and the Shao Kahn warrior faster than anything 9 feet tall should have had to defend against. The prince's guard was good. 4 arms meant 4 angles of block, and it caught Vegeta's first strike, and his second, 4 arms like tree trunks absorbing blows that had cratered mountains on lesser worlds. But the third strike wasn't aimed at its arms. Vegeta's palm caught it square in the chest, ki charged, and the Shao Kahn left its feet entirely, plowed backward through 2 of its own escort, and came to a stop 40 yards out against a standing monolith that shattered on impact. It didn't get up quickly. When it did, it was breathing hard, one arm hanging wrong, and the amusement was gone from its face, replaced by something closer to genuine alarm. "You're not," it said, voice tight, "what we've fought before." "No," Vegeta agreed, powering back down, gold fading from his hair, the crackling air around him going still. "I'm considerably worse now." He looked past the wrecked Shao Kahn prince, past its scattered escort, east toward that vast, ancient, mountain-sized signature still radiating from somewhere behind those black spires. "Take me to whoever's next in line. I didn't come all this way to be entertained by children." The Shao Kahn warrior, Goron, one of Goro's cousins in the Shao Kahn royal line, though Vegeta neither asked nor cared, pulled itself upright against the pain, and did something it hadn't expected to do when it left the outer garrison that morning. It obeyed. Word travels fast in a kingdom built on conquest, and it travels faster still when it concerns something the kingdom cannot immediately explain. By the time Goran's escort limped back through the outer gates of Shao Kahn's fortress city, half of them missing, the survivors pale and talking too fast, all of them repeating some version of the same impossible account, the report had already outpaced them through the palace's whispering channels of servants and lesser sorcerers. A single outworlder, no armor of note, no blade, struck down a border pack with his bare hands, then a Shao Kahn prince's personal guard, and asked, without a trace of fear, to be taken to something worth his time. In a throne room built from black stone and old bone, under banners stitched from the flayed standards of 100 conquered realms, Shao Kahn set down the golden goblet he'd been turning idly in one massive hand, and for the first time in longer than his court could remember, looked genuinely, dangerously curious. "Bring him to me," he said, and the words rolled through the hall like the first tremor before a mountain comes down. "I want to see this thing that thinks it's worth my time." Beside the throne, in the deep shadow of a support pillar, Shang Tsung's eyes narrowed, calculating already. Not whether this stranger was dangerous, that much was obvious, but what a soul burning that bright might be worth. And far to the east, walking unhurried and unafraid across a battlefield 3,000 years deep in bone, Vegeta felt the great slow shift in the air, something ancient turning its full attention toward him for the first time, and allowed himself, for the first time since he'd fallen through a hole in the sky, something close to a smile. Finally, he thought, something worth the trip. The road to Shao Kahn's fortress city was not a road so much as a monument to everything the combat world worshipped. Vegeta walked it under Goran's escort, what remained of it, past siege engines rusting where they'd been abandoned mid-campaign, past mass graves marked with victory standards instead of headstones, past a line of impaled figures so old their armor had fused to bone. Nobody had cleared them away. Nobody, Vegeta understood slowly, was meant to. This was a civilization that displayed its violence the way other worlds displayed art. He found, uncomfortably, that he approved of the honesty. Earth had taught him to expect violence hidden under decorum, smiling politicians, sanitized wars fought on screens instead of ground, a species that had gotten soft enough to pretend strength didn't matter while quietly worshipping it anyway. Outworld didn't bother with the pretense. Here, power was the entire conversation, spoken plainly, worn openly, and Vegeta, prince of a dead planet, last son of a warrior race that had once measured worth the same brutal way, felt something in his chest settle into place that hadn't fit right in years. This, he thought, watching the black spires of Shao Kahn's fortress climb the horizon, is a place that understands what I am. The gates themselves were carved from a single standing bone, easily 200 feet tall, ribbed like the interior of some impossible ancient beast, and they groaned open at Goran's approach with a sound like the earth itself complaining. Vegeta walked through them without slowing, without the faintest flicker of the awe he could see the surviving escort straining to hide. He'd stood in Frieza's throne room as a child, had knelt, once, only once, before a tyrant who could have unmade a planet with a raised finger. This place, for all its scale, was theater. Impressive theater, but theater. The throne room swallowed him whole regardless. A cavern of black stone lit by braziers of green fire. Banners of 100 conquered kingdoms hanging from a ceiling lost in shadow. A floor of interlocking bone tile polished to a mirror shine by centuries of blood. And at the far end, on a throne built from a mountain's worth of skulls fused together by some magic Vegeta had no name for, sat the source of that vast, ancient signature he'd tracked halfway across this broken world. Shao Kahn was larger even than Vegeta's senses had suggested. 9 feet of muscle and skull plate armor, a warhammer resting against the throne's arm like an afterthought, eyes that carried the particular flat weight of something that had conquered so many worlds the act had stopped being interesting and started being habit. He did not stand. He did not need to. His attention alone filled the room like a held breath. "So," Shao Kahn said, voice a grinding rumble that Vegeta felt in his sternum before he consciously heard it. "This is the thing that broke Goron's guard with its bare hands." "I am the thing," Vegeta said, unbowed, unmoved, arms crossing over his chest as he stopped exactly as far into the room as he chose to, and not a step further, that is still waiting for someone in this palace to be worth the walk. A ripple went through the gathered court, sorcerers in dark robes along the walls, armored generals near the dais, a scattering of conquered champions kept close the way a collector keeps trophies. Nobody spoke to Shao Kahn like that. Nobody who intended to keep speaking, at least. Shao Kahn's mouth, what was visible of it beneath the exposed jawplate, curved into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. On his, it looked like the moment before a mountain decided to fall on something. "Bold," he said, "or stupid. Outworld has swallowed both in equal measure." He leaned forward, the throne's bone groaning under the shift of his weight. "Where is your world, little conqueror? What banner do you carry?" "None," Vegeta said. "My world is dust. I watched it burn from orbit when I was too young to stop it, and I've spent every year since making certain nothing that took it from me ever gets to feel safe again." He let the words land flat, without performance. Because they weren't performance, they were simply true, in the particular way Vegeta only ever let the truth out when it served a purpose. "I am the last prince of a dead planet, tyrant. I have knelt to exactly one monster in my life, and I killed him myself, eventually, along with everything he built. So before you decide what I am, understand that I have already measured stronger things than you and found them wanting." The throne room went very still. Off to one side, half hidden in a pillar's shadow, Shang Tsung's eyes had narrowed to calculating slits, the old sorcerer's mind already turning through the implications of a soul that talked about killed gods the way other men talked about the weather. Near the dais, a massive four-armed figure, Goro, prince of the Shokan, easily as large as Shao Kahn himself, had gone still in the particular way predators go still before a decision. Shao Kahn studied Vegeta for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A sound like an avalanche starting, rolling through the hall and setting the green braziers guttering. "I have conquered 1,000 realms," Shao Kahn said, rising finally from the throne, unfolding to his full towering height, warhammer coming up into one massive hand almost lazily, and every one of their champions came before me either pleading or performing courage they didn't feel. You are neither. He stepped down off the dais, the floor's bone tile cracking faintly under each footfall. That is either the most refreshing thing I have witnessed in centuries, or the last mistake you will ever make. Test it and find out, Vegeta said, or step aside and let something in this room with an actual spine try first. He felt, rather than saw, the shift in Goro beside the dais, the Shokan prince's four fists closing, a low growl building in that massive chest, the particular restrained violence of something that had been waiting its whole life for permission it hadn't yet received. Shao Kahn raised one hand without looking, and Goro went still again, though the growl didn't fully fade. "Not yet," Shao Kahn said to Goro, to the room, to Vegeta, all at once. "I did not survive 10,000 years of conquest by throwing away curiosities before I understood their worth." His attention swung back to Vegeta, weighing him the way a merchant weighs a stone that might be nothing, might be priceless. "You will fight. Not me, Not yet. You have not earned that. You will fight in my arena, against what I choose to send, and I will watch, and I will decide what you are before I decide what to do with you." "Fine," Vegeta said, because it was, in the end, exactly what he'd wanted from the moment he'd felt this world's power spread out beneath him like a banquet. "Send everything you have. I'll go through it faster than you can replace it." They gave him a night in a stone cell that was less prison than formality. No chains, no attempt to actually contain something that had leveled a Shao Kahn guard bare-handed. Just a door and the unspoken understanding that leaving before the arena would be its own kind of insult Vegeta had no interest in delivering. He sat with his back against cold stone, eyes closed, and did what he always did the night before a real fight. Cataloged every scrap of information he'd gathered, turned it over, hunted for the shape of the world he'd fallen into. Realms, Goran had said, in the brief stretches between snarling and bleeding on the walk-in. Plural. This place, whatever it called itself, was not the whole of existence. It was one piece of something larger, something that apparently included the pale, watchful woman who'd stood near Shao Kahn's throne, silent through the entire exchange, her eyes tracking Vegeta with none of the fear the rest of the court hadn't quite managed to hide. He'd catalogued her too, without meaning to. Twin fans at her hip that weren't decorative, a stillness that read as trained rather than natural, and an expression, in the half-second before she'd looked away, that hadn't belonged in a court like this one. Something closer to recognition than hostility, as though she'd seen someone else once who fit into a place they didn't belong, the same uneasy way Vegeta clearly did. He filed it away. Interesting. Not urgent. The arena, when they brought him to it at dawn, was exactly what its architecture had promised. An amphitheater carved into the mountain itself, tiered seating rising in a bowl around a floor of packed black sand, already dark with old use. Chains and hooks bolted into the surrounding stone at intervals that told their own grim history. Shao Kahn sat in a raised box at the arena's high point, Shang Tsung at his left hand, Goro standing near enough to the dais to make his own interest in proceedings plain. The pale woman, Kitana, one of the guards had called her, though not to Vegeta directly, stood a few steps back from the throne, fans folded, watching. The crowd was smaller than Vegeta expected. Soldiers, sorcerers, a scattering of Shao Kahn's court rather than a public spectacle. This wasn't entertainment. This was an evaluation, and everyone in the stands understood it as one. Your first opponent, Shao Kahn's voice rolled down from the dais, will tell me whether you're worth a second. The gate on the arena's far side ground open, and what came through it made even Vegeta's flat expression shift, fractionally, into something like genuine attention. It was not humanoid. It moved on 4 thick legs, armored in overlapping black chitin, a head that split into 3 separate mandibled jaws, each easily large enough to take a man's torso whole. Something bred, Vegeta understood immediately, not born, grown in whatever pits produced the things that guarded Outworld's darkest places, built for exactly one purpose. It didn't hesitate at the gate. It came across the black sand at a dead sprint the instant it cleared the threshold, faster than something that size had any right to move, all 3 jaws already open. Vegeta didn't move until the last possible instant, a habit from a lifetime of measuring exactly how much effort an opponent deserved, then sidestepped the center jaw's strike with a fraction of an inch to spare, caught the creature's foreleg as it passed, and used its own momentum to redirect 400 pounds of chitin and muscle directly into the arena wall hard enough to crack stone that had presumably survived worse. It didn't die, it rounded on him again almost immediately, one jaw twisted wrong from the impact, and Vegeta felt, for the first time since he'd arrived in this world, a flicker of something worth calling respect, not for the creature's strength, which was substantial but not remarkable, but for its refusal to understand it had already lost. He ended it 3 exchanges later with a palm strike that collapsed its center mass entirely, ki charged just enough to guarantee the kill without wasting the effort Super Saiyan would have required. The creature came apart in the black sand, and the arena went very quiet. "Interesting," Shao Kahn said, from the dais, in a tone that suggested he'd expected exactly this and was pleased regardless. Again! The second opponent was worse. A pair of Tarkatan champions, veterans by the scarring on their blade arms, coordinated in a way the border pack hadn't been. Vegeta went Super Saiyan for that one, not because he needed to, but because he was growing bored of holding back against things that clearly wanted to see what he actually was. Gold light tore across the arena floor, the sand fusing to glass in a ring around him, and the fight ended in under 10 seconds. One Tarkatan's spine broken across Vegeta's knee, the other unconscious before it finished registering the first one's fate. By the fourth bout, a trio of armored soldiers wielding some kind of energy-charged glaives, coordinated, disciplined, genuinely dangerous by this world's standard, Vegeta was no longer testing anything. He was performing in the specific way he only ever performed when he understood, on some level below conscious thought, that the audience mattered. He wanted Shao Kahn to see exactly what had walked into his kingdom. He wanted the pale woman with the fans, still watching from her position near the throne, to understand it too. He wanted, more than either of those things, whatever was coming next, because 4 bouts in and barely breathing hard, Vegeta understood with the particular certainty of a man who had spent his whole life chasing a ceiling he never found, that this world hadn't yet shown him its real strength. He was right. The gate ground open a 5th time, and what walked through it this time didn't run, didn't sprint, didn't announce itself with speed or noise at all. It walked, unhurried, 4 arms loose at its sides, 9 feet of muscle and old scarring, tusks catching the arena's torchlight, and Vegeta felt, for the first time since he'd fallen through a hole in his own sky, a signature that made him actually straighten out of his casual stance. "Goro," Shao Kahn said from the dais, and there was something almost fond in the way he said it, the tone of a man unleashing a favorite weapon, Prince of the Shao Kahn, undefeated champion of 10 Mortal Kombat tournaments. Show our guest what real strength in this realm looks like. Goro didn't speak. He simply rolled all 4 shoulders, settled into a stance that made every one of his 4 arms a separate threat vector, and started walking across the black sand toward Vegeta with the calm, terrible patience of something that had never once needed to hurry toward a fight it intended to win. Vegeta felt his mouth curve. Not a smile, not quite, but close enough to one that the court watching from the tiers shifted uneasily at the sight of it. "Finally," he said, dropping back into a ready stance, gold light already beginning to bleed back into his hair. "Something that might actually make me work for it." Goro closed the distance without hurry, and Vegeta understood within the first exchange why 10 tournaments had ended with this creature's hand raised. The first blow came from the lower left arm, a testing jab, almost lazy, the kind of strike a fighter throws to measure range rather than to land. Vegeta let it pass a hair from his jaw and answered with a counter aimed at Goro's exposed ribs, expecting the same easy give he'd found in everything else this world had thrown at him. His fist connected with something that felt less like flesh and more like packed stone wrapped in muscle. Goro didn't stagger, didn't even shift his weight. The upper right arm was already moving, a backhand Vegeta barely twisted clear of, and in the half-second it took to reset his footing, the lower right arm caught him across the chest and threw him 30 feet back across the black sand. He hit, rolled, and was on his feet again before the dust settled, more surprised than hurt, genuinely surprised, an experience rare enough these days that it registered almost as pleasure. "There it is," Vegeta said, rolling the ache out of his shoulder, gold light flaring brighter around him. Something with actual weight behind it. "You hit like the champions I've already broken," Goro rumbled, 4 fists rising into a guard that covered every angle Vegeta could see, and probably several he couldn't. "I was hoping for more than a rumor." "Then stop hoping," Vegeta said, "and start regretting." He went to full Super Saiyan in a single pulse, the arena's black sand fusing to glass in a widening ring beneath him, and closed the distance himself this time. No more testing, no more measuring, just the accumulated frustration of a man who had spent years without a genuine fight, finally allowed to spend itself against something that could actually absorb the bill. The exchange that followed tore visible gouges into the arena floor. Goro's 4 arms meant 4 simultaneous angles of attack, and for the first time since falling into this world, Vegeta found himself genuinely defending as much as striking, ducking under a high hook, only to catch a low sweep across the shins that would have taken a lesser fighter's legs out from under him, weaving past a grab that would have ended the fight instantly if it had landed, answering with strikes that Goro absorbed with grunts of real effort, rather than the contemptuous ease he'd shown at the fight's opening. In the raised box above the arena, Shao Kahn leaned forward, elbows on his knees, an expression on his exposed jaw that might, on a smaller man, have been called delight. Beside him, Shang Tsung's calculating eyes had stopped tracking the fight's mechanics and started tracking something else entirely. The raw quantity of power bleeding off the golden-haired stranger with every exchange, cataloging it the way a jeweler catalogs a stone too large to have an honest origin. And a few steps back from the throne, Kitana watched with an expression she was working very hard to keep unreadable, because what she was actually feeling, watching someone fight Goro to something like a standstill, watching someone who so plainly did not belong to Outworld's endless machinery of conquest and did not seem to care, was not something she wanted Shao Kahn's court reading off her face. The fight ground on. Goro landed a blow that cracked 2 of Vegeta's ribs and sent him skidding across glass-fused sand. Vegeta answered with a ki-charged strike that split stone behind Goro when the Shao Kahn prince barely twisted clear of it. Neither gave ground for longer than it took to reset. Neither, for the first time in either of their considerable careers, was entirely certain how the exchange would end. It was Vegeta who broke the stalemate, not through more power, but through the particular cruelty of a fighter who had spent a lifetime learning that the biggest opponent isn't always the smartest one. He let Goro's upper left grab connect, let the Shao Kahn prince's fist close around his forearm with crushing, triumphant force, and used the anchor point to swing his entire body around and drive both boots into the side of Goro's skull with every scrap of ki he'd been holding in reserve. Goro went down. Not out, Vegeta could feel the signature still burning, dazed and furious, but very much alive. But down, one knee driven into shattered glass sand, 4 arms braced to keep from collapsing entirely, blood running from a gash above one tusked jaw. The arena had gone utterly silent. Vegeta stood over him, breathing hard for the first time since he'd arrived in this world. Ribs aching, gold light guttering back down toward black hair, and found, genuinely, unexpectedly, that he respected the thing bleeding on the ground in front of him. "Stay down," Vegeta said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat honesty of a fighter who'd learned the hard way what it cost to keep getting up against something stronger. You've got nothing left to prove to me. You hit harder than anything I've fought in years. Goro looked up at him, furious, humiliated, and beneath both of those things, something that might have been the first honest respect he'd offered an opponent in a decade of unbroken victories. Next time, Goro said through blood and a cracked tusk, there will be no next time you catch me the same way. Good, Vegeta said, stepping back to let him rise on his own terms, because some part of him understood, without needing the thought spelled out, that this creature's pride mattered as much as his own did. I'd be disappointed if you didn't learn something. From the raised box, Shao Kahn rose to his feet, and the sound of 10,000 years of conquest deciding something mattered rolled through the arena like the opening note of a war. Enough, Shao Kahn said, and the single word carried to every corner of the amphitheater. I have seen what I needed to see. They brought Vegeta back to the throne room rather than the cell this time, which he understood, correctly, as a shift in status. Goro walked beside him now instead of behind, nursing a jaw that would take days to fully knit even with whatever this world's healers could offer, throwing Vegeta the occasional sidelong look that had shed most of its earlier hostility and replaced it with something more complicated, the particular respect predators reserve for other predators who've earned the right to stand in the same room without a leash. Shao Kahn was already on his throne when they arrived, Warhammer resting across his knees, and this time he didn't make Vegeta wait at a distance. He gestured him forward, close enough that the two of them stood nearly eye to eye despite the tyrant's superior height, close enough that the rest of the court held its breath at the audacity of it. You beat my champion, Shao Kahn said. Not killed, beat. Restrained yourself at the end, which tells me either you have limits I haven't found, or you have judgment sharper than your temper suggests. Which is it, little conqueror? Both, Vegeta said, because it was true, and because he'd learned long ago that half-truths were wasted on men who could smell weakness through them anyway. I don't kill things I respect unless they force the issue. Your champion didn't force it. He fought like something worth keeping alive. Something shifted in Shao Kahn's expression, not softness, nothing so simple as that, but a recalibration, the particular look of a conqueror realizing the thing standing in front of him operated on a code rather than simple bloodlust, and codes, Shao Kahn's 10,000 years had taught him, were both more dangerous and more useful than bloodlust ever was. I am going to make you an offer, Shao Kahn said, and I want you to understand it is an honest one, not a trap dressed as a courtesy. Outworld is vast. Outworld is hungry. I am always, always in need of champions who can match what you've shown me today. Kneel to me, fight under my banner, and there is no realm in existence you would not be given the chance to break. The throne room held its breath. Beside the dais, Shang Tsung's fingers had gone very still against his robes, the old sorcerer watching this exchange with the focus of a man calculating what happened to his own position if this offer landed. Near the back, Kitana's expression had not changed at all, which was, in its own way, the loudest reaction in the room. Vegeta considered the offer for exactly as long as courtesy required, and not a second longer. No. The word dropped into the throne room like a stone into still water. I've knelt to exactly one tyrant in my life, Vegeta continued, before the silence could curdle into something Shao Kahn's guards might feel obligated to act on, and it took me years to burn that debt off my name. I'm not adding a second one. Not to you. Not to anyone. He held Shao Kahn's stare, unblinking, unafraid, the particular fearlessness of a man who had genuinely already survived worse than whatever consequence might follow. But I didn't come to this world to sit idle either. If you want to see what I can actually do, send me against something that's earned the honor of testing me instead of insulting me with scraps. I'll fight for the challenge. I won't fight for you." For a long, dangerous moment, nobody in the throne room breathed. Then Shao Kahn laughed. The same avalanche sound from the day before, but different now, edged with something that might, on a being capable of it, have been genuine admiration. 10,000 years, Shao Kahn said, and men still walk into my throne room hoping flattery buys them survival. You are the first in longer than I can remember to walk in and simply tell me no. He settled back against the throne, warhammer shifting against his knee, considering. "Very well, little conqueror. You will not kneel. Fine. But you will not simply walk free of Outworld either. Not with power like yours loose and unaccounted for. You will remain here, under my banner, though not my leash, and you will fight when I require a fight worth watching. In exchange, you eat at my table, you sleep under my roof, and no soul in this kingdom troubles you without my leave." His eyes narrowed, weighing Vegeta one final time. "That is the offer that replaces the first one. Take it, or leave my kingdom and discover exactly how hospitable the rest of these realms are to something with no banner and no allies." It wasn't submission. Vegeta understood that distinction with the particular clarity of a man who'd spent a lifetime refusing to mistake convenient arrangements for genuine loyalty. It was closer to what he'd once had with the Z-Fighters, in the ugliest, most honest reading of it. Proximity without belonging, cooperation without surrender, a place to stand while he figured out what this fractured, violent world actually was, and what, if anything, in it was worth his real allegiance. "Fine," Vegeta said. "I'll stay. But understand something, tyrant. I'm not your weapon. I'm a guest who hasn't decided yet whether your kingdom deserves to keep me." "A guest?" Shao Kahn repeated, something almost like amusement in the grinding weight of his voice. "Who broke 6 of my border guard, humiliated a Shokan escort, and fought my undefeated champion to his knees on his first day in my realm." He shook his head slowly. "Outworld has seen stranger things, rarely better ones. They gave him quarters in the fortress itself, sparse, stone-walled, entirely unnecessary given how little Vegeta actually required for comfort, but a clear signal of status regardless. He was standing at the single narrow window, looking out over a landscape of black spires and distant smoke, cataloging what he'd learned and what he still didn't understand, when the door opened without a knock. Katana stood in the frame, fan still folded at her hip, expression carefully neutral in the specific way of someone who had spent years learning to keep her real thoughts off her face in this exact fortress. "You turned down a kingdom," she said, without preamble. "Nobody does that." "Not to him. I've turned down worse offers from worse men," Vegeta said, not turning from the window. "A crown from a tyrant isn't worth what it costs to wear it." Something flickered across her expression, recognition again, the same thing he'd caught in the throne room the day before. "You speak like someone who's seen this kingdom before, or one enough like it." "I have." Vegeta finally turned to face her, arms crossing, weighing her the way he weighed everything. For use, for threat, for whether she was worth the effort of an honest answer. "My own people served a tyrant like yours once. Different face, same appetite. It cost us everything before it was done costing." He studied her a moment longer. "You're not one of his." "Not really. I've seen enough loyal dogs today to recognize the difference." Kitana's jaw tightened, the mask slipping for exactly a fraction of a second before she caught it. Careful what you say inside these walls, Outworlder. Not every ear here is friendly, and not every silence means safety. Is that a warning? Vegeta asked, or an offer? Consider it, Katana said, already turning to leave. The first honest thing anyone in this fortress has told you. She paused at the door, glancing back. There's more to this world than Shao Kahn's throne room. More sides than the ones he's shown you. When you're ready to see them, ask for me by name, not before. The door closed behind her, and Vegeta stood alone in the narrow stone room, turning the exchange over with the same careful attention he'd given every scrap of intelligence since falling through the sky. Interesting, he thought. A kingdom this large doesn't stay unified without cracks somewhere in the foundation. And cracks are always worth finding before someone else decides to use them against you. Outside the window, the twin moons were rising over Outworld's black spires, and somewhere far beyond them, in towers Vegeta hadn't yet felt the edges of, an old sorcerer sat considering exactly what a soul that powerful might be worth to a man who'd spent centuries collecting them. Sleep, for a Saiyan raised on distrust, was never truly deep. Vegeta had learned as a child under Frieza's rule that the difference between waking at dawn and waking at all sometimes came down to a single half-conscious thread of awareness kept burning through the night, and 3 days into Outworld's hospitality, that old instinct was the only reason he woke at all. The sensation wasn't pain. It was worse, a pull, faint but unmistakable, something reaching past skin and muscle toward the part of him that had nothing to do with either. He opened his eyes in the dark stone room to find the air itself gone wrong, threaded with pale green light seeping in through the door's edges, and a presence outside that hadn't been there when he'd finally let himself rest. Vegeta was on his feet before the thought fully formed, ki flaring instinctively into a defensive shell around him, and the pulling sensation snapped like an overtaut wire, throwing whatever had been reaching for him backward with enough force to crack stone in the corridor beyond. He tore the door open to find Shang Tsung on one knee in the hallway, robes smoking faintly at the sleeves, both hands pressed to his chest where the sudden backlash had struck him. The old sorcerer's face, for the first time since Vegeta had arrived in this world, had lost its perpetual calm and shown something closer to genuine shock. "You were supposed to be asleep," Shang Tsung said before he could stop himself, and the admission hung in the air between them, damning and unmistakable. "I was," Vegeta said, and the fury building in his chest was cold rather than hot, the particular controlled rage he reserved for things that tried to take from him without the courage to ask first. "Until something tried to reach into me and take what wasn't offered." Shang Tsung rose, robes settling back into their usual composed drape, some of the shock smoothing over into calculation. "A misunderstanding. I merely sought to—" "Don't!" The word cracked through the corridor like a whip. "I've had exactly one creature try to reach inside me and claim what I am. He harvested planets to do it. I watched him do it to people I loved before I was strong enough to stop him." Vegeta's ki flared brighter, the corridor's stone beginning to hairline crack under the pressure of it, and Shang Tsung took an involuntary step back, a sorcerer who had stolen 1,000 souls across 1,000 years, suddenly, unmistakably afraid. "So when I tell you that whatever spell you just tried to work on me is the single fastest way to die in this fortress, understand that I am not exaggerating for effect." "Careful," Shang Tsung managed, drawing himself back up, some of the old composure returning even through the fear. "The Emperor granted you hospitality, not immunity from consequence. Threaten his sorcerer and—" "I'm not threatening you," Vegeta said. "I'm informing you. There's a difference, and you're about to learn it if you don't walk away from this door right now." Shang Tsung walked away. Vegeta watched him go, robes disappearing around a corner too quickly for someone claiming innocence, and felt the last of his patience with this fortress's quieter cruelties burn away to nothing. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat instead with his back against cold stone, cataloging what had just happened with the same cold precision he'd once used to catalog Frieza's court, who served the throne out of genuine loyalty, who served it out of fear, and who, like the sorcerer who'd just tried to steal something no one had offered, served it only until a better opportunity presented itself. Shao Kahn ruled through strength Vegeta could respect, however little he agreed with what that strength was spent on. Shang Tsung was something else entirely, a parasite wearing the shape of a courtier, and parasites, in Vegeta's considerable experience, eventually had to be cut out. He found Goro at first light, in a training yard cut into the fortress's lower levels, working through forms alone with the particular discipline of someone who'd never once let an injury slow his return to readiness. The Shokan Prince's jaw had healed to an ugly half-set line, a permanent reminder of their first meeting, but he straightened at Vegeta's approach without hostility. "You look like a man who slept badly," Goro observed. "I didn't sleep at all," Vegeta said. "Your sorcerer tried to take something from me that wasn't his to reach for." Something shifted across Goro's tusked face, not surprise, which told Vegeta more than the reaction itself would have. Shang Tsung collects souls the way other men collect trophies. It is tolerated because the Emperor finds it useful, and because most who cross him don't survive long enough to complain. He studied Vegeta a moment longer. "You survived." "He didn't get close enough to finish," Vegeta said. "Next time, I won't be as patient about the difference." Goro was quiet for a moment, turning something over behind his eyes that Vegeta recognized. The specific calculation of a warrior deciding how much honesty an outsider had actually earned. "There are things in this fortress," Goro said finally, "that even the Emperor does not fully control. Shang Tsung serves his own hunger as much as he serves Shao Kahn's throne. If you've made an enemy of him, you would do well to make certain the Emperor understands why, before Shang Tsung has the chance to tell his own version first." "Good advice," Vegeta said. "I intend to." Shao Kahn received him in the throne room within the hour, and Vegeta found, watching the tyrant's face as he laid out exactly what had happened in the night, that the report landed harder than he'd expected. Shao Kahn's expression didn't shift toward outrage. That would have been too simple a read for a man who'd ruled through calculated cruelty for 10,000 years. But something in the set of his jaw tightened, the particular stillness of a ruler recalculating the value of a subordinate he'd allowed too long a leash. "Shang Tsung has served this throne since before your world's sun finished cooling," Shao Kahn said slowly, "and he has never once reached for something of mine without permission." He looked at Vegeta with new, sharper attention. "You are not mine, not yet. Perhaps that is precisely why he thought he could take you unclaimed." "Then claim me or don't," Vegeta said, "but keep your sorcerer's hands off what he hasn't earned the right to touch. I gave you my word I'd stay under your roof while I decided what your kingdom was worth. I didn't give anyone the right to try stealing the decision out from under me." Shao Kahn was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Vegeta couldn't fully read behind those flat, ancient eyes. Then he rose, warhammer coming up into one hand, and the entire throne room seemed to draw a collective breath. "You want proof," Shao Kahn said, "that this kingdom deals honestly with what it values. Very well, I will give you the only proof that has ever mattered in Outworld." He stepped down off the dais, the floor cracking faintly beneath each footfall, and for the first time since Vegeta had arrived, the tyrant's full, terrible attention settled on him with intent rather than curiosity. "Fight me, Not my champion, not my sorcerer's tricks. Me. If you stand against what I actually am and walk away still standing, you will have earned every protection this throne can offer, and Shang Tsung will learn precisely what happens to those who touch what belongs under my banner without leave. The court scattered backward without needing to be told, clearing the throne room's floor with the particular haste of people who had seen what happened to standing architecture the last time Shao Kahn fought in earnest. Vegeta felt something settle into place in his chest. The thing he'd been chasing since he first felt this world's power spread out beneath him on that first cratered morning. Not a test. Not an evaluation. The real thing, finally, standing in front of him with a warhammer in one massive hand and 10,000 years of unbroken conquest behind every motion. "Finally!" Vegeta said, and gold light began to bleed into his hair. "Something worth everything I gave up to get here." Shao Kahn moved first, and the warhammer came down in an arc that would have ended a lesser fight in a single blow. Vegeta barely cleared it, the stone floor where he'd stood a heartbeat earlier caving inward under an impact that shook the whole fortress. He didn't get a second to recover before the hammer's return arc was already coming, and he understood in the same instant that this was not going to be Goro's fight repeated at larger scale. This was something else entirely. Raw, ancient, purpose-built power that had spent 10 millennia learning exactly how to end things. He went to Super Saiyan without ceremony, no testing, no measured escalation, because measuring against this opponent was a luxury he didn't have the margin for. Gold light tore across the throne room, the floor beneath him fusing and cracking in equal measure, and he met Shao Kahn's next swing with both forearms raised, absorbing an impact that sent him skidding 20 feet across bone tile, with his teeth rattling and every nerve in his arms screaming. "Good," Shao Kahn rumbled, and there was genuine pleasure in it, the specific satisfaction of a warrior who'd waited a long time to find something that made him work. Better than good. Show me the rest. Vegeta showed him. The fight that followed tore through the throne room in a way that made the earlier arena bouts look like children's games. Vegeta pushed past Super Saiyan almost immediately, gold light flaring brighter, hair standing in a full corona as he matched Shao Kahn's raw physical power with speed the tyrant hadn't yet accounted for, striking from angles that shouldn't have been possible against something that size, forcing Shao Kahn to actually work to track him rather than simply swinging with confident, unhurried force. Braziers shattered. Support pillars cracked and fell. The ancient banners lining the walls caught fire from stray blasts of ki that scorched black stone white hot, and still neither of them slowed, both driven by the same starving hunger for a fight that finally, genuinely mattered. It was Vegeta who found the opening first, not through more power, because Shao Kahn's raw strength remained, even now, a hair beyond what he could match blow for blow, but through the same cruel precision that had ended his fight with Goro. He let a hammer swing past closer than instinct wanted, used the wind of its passage to close distance instead of retreating, and drove a ki-charged palm strike directly into Shao Kahn's exposed ribs with every scrap of power he had left in reserve. The impact staggered the tyrant, actually staggered him, forced him back a full step for the first time in the fight, cracked skull-plate armor at the point of contact. Shao Kahn's counter came a half-second slower than every blow before it, and Vegeta was already moving, already inside the hammer's reach, driving a second strike into the same cracked armor before Shao Kahn could fully reset. They broke apart at the same instant, both breathing hard, both bleeding. Vegeta from a gash across one cheekbone where a near miss had clipped him, Shao Kahn from the cracked ribs beneath ruined armor plate, and stood facing each other across a throne room that had been reduced to smoking rubble and shattered bone tile. Neither moved to close the distance again. "Enough!" Shao Kahn said, finally lowering the warhammer, and the word carried none of the earlier command's weight. This time it was simply true. The honest assessment of a warrior who understood, with absolute clarity, that continuing further would cost both of them more than either currently had the margin to spend. Enough, little conqueror. I have my answer. Vegeta powered down slowly, gold fading back to black, ribs aching where a glancing blow had cracked something he'd deal with later, and found that the fury that had carried him into this fight had burned away into something calmer, more honest. So do I, he said. Shao Kahn studied him across the wreckage of his own throne room, and something passed across the tyrant's face that Vegeta hadn't seen there before. Not quite respect, because Shao Kahn had spent too many centuries above the need for such a simple word, but something adjacent to it, the particular recognition one apex predator offers another after confirming, definitively, that the fight would have been close enough to matter. Shang Tsung will not touch you again, Shao Kahn said. That, I promise on this throne, whatever remains of it, you have earned that much, if nothing else. He turned, warhammer resting once more against one massive shoulder, surveying the ruin of his own hall with something almost like satisfaction. Rebuild this, he said to no one and everyone, the court beginning tentatively to emerge from whatever cover they'd found. And send word to every corner of this kingdom. Outworld has a new name worth fearing, and I would prefer the realms learn it from us, before they learn it the hard way themselves. Vegeta said nothing to that, watching the tyrant walk back toward the cracked remains of his throne, and found, standing alone in the smoking wreckage of a room that had nearly killed him twice in 3 days, that he felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit. Satisfied. Genuinely, thoroughly satisfied. Not because he'd won, because he hadn't. Not cleanly, not in any way either of them would call decisive, but because for the first time since Majin Buu's threat had faded into memory and left him with nothing left to chase, he'd found a world with a ceiling he hadn't yet touched the top of. Near the shattered doorway, half hidden in drifting smoke, Kitana watched him with an expression she'd stopped bothering to fully hide, and Vegeta caught her eye across the ruin and held it a moment longer than courtesy required. More sides than the ones he's shown you, she'd said. He was starting to understand, finally, exactly what she'd meant, and exactly how much more of this fractured, violent, magnificent world was still waiting for him to find it. The fortress rebuilt itself over the following weeks, stone by stone, and Vegeta rebuilt himself alongside it, cracked ribs knitting, the gash along his cheekbone fading to a thin, pale line he'd wear, unbothered, for the rest of whatever this new life turned out to be. Shang Tsung kept his distance, and his hands strictly to himself. Goro nodded to him now in the training yards. The particular nod warriors save for equals rather than curiosities, and Shao Kahn, on the rare occasions their paths crossed through the fortress's rebuilt halls, spoke to him the way a conqueror speaks to a weapon he hasn't yet decided how to aim, carefully, and with something that might, eventually, become trust. But it was Kitana's offer that stayed with him longest, the quiet promise of more sides to this world than a single throne room's worth of ambition, more realms than the one he'd fallen into, more fights worth having than any single kingdom could contain. Vegeta hadn't taken her up on it yet. He would, soon. He stood at his narrow window that final night, watching twin moons climb over black spires, and understood with total clarity that he hadn't found a home in this world. He'd found something better, a ceiling he hadn't touched the top of, a war he hadn't finished measuring, and a kingdom of realms still waiting, unclaimed, for a prince with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, beyond Outworld's borders entirely, the realms turned on, indifferent to the fact that something had just entered their war that none of them were fully prepared for. Vegeta smiled into the dark, and for the first time since his own world had burned to ash beneath him, felt something close to home.